Okay. Um, so I'm Jason E. Bowman, and I work at the Valand Academy at the University of Gothenburg. And I'm going to talk about a research project called Stretched. It's in its very early sort of stages. We received finance from the Swedish Research Council. We were informed that we were awarded in October, and the project really only just began in sort of a early sort of mid-February, so it's quite recent. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the project itself, what it tries to do, sort of in a sense why I personally wanted to do it, and what I have been doing in this very beginning sort of phase. Okay. So I'm also going to begin with a quote from Arendt, from The Human Condition, as well. And above it is this kind of line on initiating, running, centering, and leading, which are sort of terminologies and languages that are used often in this kind of culture, but which in the current moment we could potentially think of as quite problematic in terms of the neoliberal politic of what does it mean when an artist initiates and is entrepreneurial, what does it mean when they run something in management terms, what does it mean when they demand center instead of periphery, and what does it mean for them to be leaders. So whilst these terminologies kind of sort of arise from a sort of point in the 60s and 70s in the alternative space movement, maybe we need to begin to reconsider what they mean in the current political frame. But nevertheless, I'm sort of interested in what Arendt is saying here in terms of power and the space of appearance, and it's from section 28 of The Human Condition. So it's a question of the interface and relations between word and deed. And I'm not a linguistic theorist, I'm not a discourse analyst in terms of languages, but I'm seeing certain things that may be particular or conflictual to what our compass may tell us the history of this is, and I'm concerned by the interface of word and deed within it. I think this is Francis Cape's Utopian Benches. It's an artwork. It is what it is. A set of reconstructions of utopian benches from utopian communities across sort of histories, from Shakerism through to sort of other sort of religious or imaginative communities. And whilst the project is called Stretched, I'm also in a sense concerned with shrinking. And the shrinking that the project kind of seeks to consider is the shrinking that may be anti-political and the shrinking that takes place that results in de-imagining within a neoliberal politic, and the decline in a sense of civic literacies, and the attacks on civic values that occur within that. And the way that those commanding institutions, so the museological frame, in a way begin to become divorced from matters of ethics, social responsibility, and civic engagement. And so what happens within that sort of separating of us within the kind of political sphere of togetherness is that the institution potentially in its act of privatization, this possessive individualism, begins to inundate a certain particularity around a social life. And social life where there is a loss of function in the critical aspect of civic education and the way that we can co-learn and co-be together. And so a dismissal of a substantive democracy. Okay, so the project in a sense originates from an observation of shrinking as opposed to stretching. Stretching itself as a kind of sort of set of behaviors in a way is making something capable, so giving capability to something to become wider, but without it tearing or breaking or falling apart. It causes something to be extended, to be distended, or to be drawn out. It allows a body to extend, for example, to a full length. So it allows something to both tighten and become muscular and rigorous. It also potentially has a capacity to lie down, so to become prone in stretching. It also can stretch in terms of geographies and times. And it can cause for something to be longer than to be expected. I mean, this is an observational thing, it's an emotive and affective thing in a sense, but one of the things that I'm curious about in terms of artist-led cultures is, why does it continue to repeat? Why do generations of people want to repeat this activity? What is its repetitive frame? And what are the echoes and reverberations of that frame? Stretching also does something to resources. It makes demand, in a sense, on a resource, but it also requires people to maximize their abilities or capacities. And it adapts and extends the scope of something. Okay. The project is quite narrow in a sense, it's quite specific. So, like any academic frame, in a way, it's to produce new knowledge or to nuance existing knowledge. You know, sort of, I come from both a situation where I was trained as an artist and then from a cultural studies background. You know, so I'm still kind of concerned with the possibilities of constellations and assemblages within a kind of cultural studies sort of model. But what I'm concerned with most, in a sense, with Stretched is, what does the question of artistic practice mean within artist-led cultures? So we no longer have solely the modernist compass of somebody who makes artworks for modes of display. We have a whole set of different modes of labor, different things that people are doing, and they are doing it under the auspices of being an artist, not as a bureaucrat, not necessarily as a curator, but also within these hybridized models of artist as educator, artist as curator, artist as organizer, artist as activist, etc. So there's a dynamic note, and these things are not even singular hybrids anymore. You know, sort of, so we have the artist curator, but actually the artist curator, activist, educator. So this stretching is occurring within it. So I basically want to try and find out what this means as practice, and what, in a sense, when we can get closer to that, what that may then mean to the question of the curatorial. So how do we represent these modes and extensions and stretching of practices in ways that support people to gain greater intimacy with what artistic practice is? I want to do this in a way because of previous sort of projects that have built up particular sort of ways of thinking about it. So, for example, Midwest, which I won't talk about today because Julie sort of looked at that, which I don't think even at the time of sort of making it, we were really fundamentally considering it within the curatorial. But ostensibly that's what it was a set of dialogue frameworks, processual, longitudinal over time, with communities, educative, pedagogical, etc. But then there's other things that I've done to try and consider this notion of extended practices. So I curated a retrospective of Yvonne Rainer in live dance, film, writing, poetry, and education. So interrogating the possibility of extended practice through one specific practitioner who's been doing this for a long period of time, but who also has been concerned at points in her career with instituting. So establishing Judson, establishing collaborations with other practitioners, etc. So it was a way for me to, through the prism of one practice, begin to question this idea of how do we make this thing public, and what sort of strategies and modalities of curating can allow us to do that. While I was kind of curating this Rainer sort of project, and citing it not only within exhibition spaces, but for example within the Women's Library in Glasgow where Yvonne read, etc. The project was taking place in multiple environments, and it all took place within a 6-day period. So a very truncated notion of time, and it was not curated in any chronological sense. It was actually curated through a patterning of movement from arena work. I also curated a project called Adhocracy, which was involved this thing, which is a rally of speeches by a set of practitioners who were involved in collective sort of behaviours within sort of modes of radical practice in the UK, for which Andrea was the moderator of this whole sort of day of sort of stuff, and it included people like Marlene Smith here from the Black Art Group and Pan-African Collective in the UK, Ilona Halberstadt from the Scratch Orchestra, David Curtis, who established a thing called Arts Labs in the UK, which were the model for art centres, sort of for cross-media, and the Intermedial, sort of Simon Watney, who was a very significant AIDS activist, sort of established a thing called Outrage. Sort of Kate Hudson, who was the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the UK, who talked about the interface of art and CND, etc. Sort of, but also had events, sort of like this, sort of which is a voting system for what people do with money, by the people speak, sort of radical ceramics, sort of by Kari Reichardt, who's an anarchist potter and ceramicist. Sort of print workshops. Jess Baines, who is an academic researcher examining the history of sort of feminist radical print workshops, who was one of the other speakers in the rally that Andrea considered. So social frames, in a sense, of multiplicities, but also diversities of histories, and again, non in chronological modes. This is Joop van Lieshout's Slave City Boardroom from 2007. The project will be informed by this notion of the curatorial. So in the curatorial, in a sense, has been a burgeoning debate, but a young one from the 90s, and it is a question also stretching. So how do we expand beyond the notion of the curator being somebody who is responsible for a collection, who is responsible for preservation situations, etc. And it doesn't only deal with the display of artworks anymore either, but it is potentially more longitudinal. It is less object-related, it is dialogic, it's participatory, it's performative, it's collaborative, it's research-oriented, but it is concerned with social and political discourses and perhaps has a capacity to consider change. At the same time, I'm also conscious of certain art historic frameworks, and I'm not an art historian, but sort of I find myself quite often having to gravitate towards my desire to ignore it in one hand and my fascination with it in the other sense. But I'm not methodologically trained as an art historian. This is a diagram by McCunis, so from the Fluxus movement in 1966, of expanded art. So there's a set of precedents around things I'm beginning to sort of look at and examine, but they're not even solely within this moment of what Dick Higgins would consider to be the intermedia, sort of on this notion of expanded practice from mid-50s, so from late modernity into sort of 1978. There are other things that I'm considering, sort of much of which are indebted to other people's work. So, sort of João Ribeira, the Portuguese-American curator, recently published an article in After All, which was also represented at a conference at Bard on the future curatorial, which Valand was a partner with, where Ribeira began to sort of consider the advent of the solo exhibition, but also the eviction of the solo exhibition from discourse in the curatorial. But what I was interested in, and it wasn't necessarily the focus of Ribeira's research, was that Nathaniel Hone, in art historical terms, was the first artist evicted from the Academy, and the Academy didn't want to display these works, decided to rent a shop and make his own exhibition. So in a sense, a beginning both of individualism, but a beginning of the artist-led at the same time, and very pop-up, and all comes with all the problematics of the pop-up. As other factors, situations that I'm interested in, there's actually been very limited research done. This is a artist breakfast at Skogen, which many people know, and it's in the Gothenburg Museum of art, and I'm actually interested in the question of artist colonies of the 19th century as artist-led situations. And there's only been two real significant sort of bodies of research conducted into those things, and they have three primary models, and they're village-related models. So one of them is villages with transient and fluctuating populations. So people who visit for a short period of time to produce art making, but have impact and effects on the communities that they are transient amidst. Then there are semi-permanent models. So some artists who live there and network with other people. So other people arrive to produce the plan, air paintings, etc. And then there are villages that had very stable and permanent communities with less fluctuating people moving between them. So border crossers, networks, and the possibility of sort of place. So transient and intransient communities. And then there are particular modes of sort of instituting in early sort of art historic frames. So, for example, these are the people who established the Vienna Secession. And Julie and I went to a conference in Vancouver that came before the conference that Alison was talking about yesterday, where the claim was made in the conference called Infest, that the Vienna Secession is the oldest artist-run centre in the world. I've also been, and I'm showing many of these things as examples because the pile of shit on my desk is huge. These are just small examples. Is that there's also a history of large, small, formal and informal groups of exhibition societies that occur in the sort of mid-19th century through to the early 20th century, which had primary mission, I suppose, to sustain public awareness of modernity and modern art and its possibilities. So there were many of these, but what they were trying to do, in a sense, was to influence fin de siècle art. But they were collaborative and cooperative organizations, but at the same time were promoting the work of individuals. And they were taking place right across Central and Northern Europe, and many of them became sustainable. Yeah, this is an image, that is of a Polish organization, and it is a diagram, basically, of a geography and these people in the network of the geography, So I've started to sort of look at these art historic sort of frames around these sort of artist societies at the same time. So when their formations, how they're being formed, what it is they're seeking to do. And also looking at visualities quite a lot. I mean, I didn't really realize necessarily until I began to put this presentation together that actually what I was finding mostly was documentation of seats, chairs, people in conversation and dialogue, and people in mobility and transport. So artist breakfast paintings, Francis Cape's chairs, and this, which is a bus trip to Bulgaria by the Polish Arts Association in the 1950s, so people transporting themselves around political frames at the same time. There are other precedents that we should be aware of, potentially on a more localized level. So Gallery 54 is in Gothenburg, where the Akademin is, and Gallery 54 is also one of the oldest artist-run centres in Europe, and was established, the actual gallery space was established in 1958. So obviously it's moved geographies and is a different building from its originating building, but it basically also was established as an alternative to what people were pissed off with within the Gothenburg situation. And there's research being conducted called Skioscope by Gothenburg Museum that kind of focuses on the history of arts within Gothenburg specifically, but not much attention being paid to artist-led activities within it. There is, to go back to the conversation yesterday within our little group around the where precedents and why precedents are strategically important. So there has been work done in Gothenburg like this, which is a publication coming out of the artist-led space Signal in Malmo. It's a parallel history of the independent art arenas of Skåne, so the Skåne region, between 1968 and 2008. So 40-year history of artist-led activities within that sort of region. I'm very conscious of the work that lots of other people are doing in economies, sort of yourself, including Andrea, and I'm not an economist and I'm not a sociologist, but there are things that I think are worth considering, which I'm not really seeing in those debates around economy, which are, for example, a report in 2013 by the Aspen Institute, which examines the financial impacts of artist-endowed foundations. So foundations that are in the name of an artist and operate through bequests. And interestingly, within this report, there are now 363 artist foundations in the United States. And because of the increase of the art market, their art assets are increasing extremely highly as well. And compared to other foundations, artist-led foundations, artist-endowed foundations, their assets are increasing 180% higher than other foundations. So there are modes of sort of financial sort of frameworks that sit in our historic references in particular ways around economies. I'm also, this is Rita McBride's Arena, sort of very present sort of piece of work throughout the early 2000s, etc. I am, and I'm going to quote Gerald Raunic on instituting, because it's very present as a debate. And basically what Raunic's sort of quote of instituting is, the various arrangements of self-organization promote broad participation in instituting, because they newly compose themselves as a constituent power again and again. And it was in reading this quote, this is the moment where I'm going, why does this artist-led thing consistently seek endurance for itself? But also tying into local and global struggles. So this interface between kind of communities of togetherness, of us being a we within a sort of global frame, but also recognizing the conditions, particularities, and potentially barriers of local frames. I'm not particularly concerned at this point on this sort of assimilation of artist-led spaces or cultures into particular exhibition sort of modes, but we have seen particular things around that. So, for example, No Soul for Sale at Tate Modern in 2010, which was a large gathering of artist-led spaces around Europe, none of whom were paid to be there, or funded to attend. The fourth Gwangju Biennial in 2002, which was entirely sort of handed over to artist-led spaces. Hans-Ulrich Obrist's Life Live at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris in the late 90s, 96. And I'm only really kind of beginning to scope some stuff around what rhetorics were being used in this assimilation of the artist-led into these institutional sort of frames. But the other thing that I wanted to, and have been looking at, is the nature of the types of conversations we've been having here for the past 2 days. And that these conversations are not happening in an isolated geographic frame at all. They are happening in multiplicities in many, many different places, and they are not happening even solely within a sort of debate of a national frame or within a state, in a sense. So they are interregional. And they include things, for example, such as this, which is Artists Organizations International, which brought 20 representatives of organizations together, sort of organizations that were founded by artists, but which art making or art production may not be their primary concern, to discuss politics, economy and education, immigration and ecology. And the question of how do these organizations institute themselves and what is the performance of political and social agendas within them, and there are multiple sort of people involved in this 3-day event. I'm interested in the aesthetics of these things too, actually. I'm interested in what aesthetic languages are being used within these collections of people, these conferences, these symposia, these events, because speech, talking, listening, hearing are very much part of their sort of dynamic. Language is quite often projected and framed. We saw that in Alison's presentation yesterday. Here are the questions that are being kind of asked, etc. And in this particular organization by artists, we sort of see particular sort of ways of sort of breaking languages apart, stretching sort of things. Yeah, that's fine. You know, sort of we see people like Artists of Rahova, the Artists Association of Azawad at this event, the Bureau for Anti-Propaganda, what is needed, from Russia, concerned artists of the Philippines, forensic architecture, which has a position at Goldsmiths at the same time, Grupo, etc. So a global conversation that is occurring between multiple people who are crossing borders to have these discussions, but also Jonas Stahl, who's the artist responsible for this, is also producing artifacts, objects, artworks, models of these conversations. This is an image from a condition report, which was an event organised by the Raw Material Company in Dakar, Senegal, which was a question around what our institutions are happening within African regions, and the particular nature of different modes of economy within those, PP2 basically, private-public partnerships. So how can something be independent and have private funding, because certain African regions are very low on particular funding. So we can't assume that this question of the state funding and independence artist-led is happening in the same geography all the time, because there are many geographies, and particularly geographies that are addressed as geographies in crisis, which they are navigating this identity of crisis, but for which public money is circulating. And that private money is becoming engaged, but there are also organizations, for example, like the Ford Foundation, that are running through many of these kinds of dynamics at the same time. Prince Claus Fund in Sweden, in Denmark, in the Netherlands, are funding many activities. Norway is interestingly also funding many activities actually in African states, around artist-led activities, instituting new developments. This is institutions by artists that Alison addressed yesterday, so I won't talk about it specifically. This is an event that I participated in. This is Todd Lester in the middle. This was the Triangle Network, which had hit its kind of 30th year of activity, and this was a global conference called Networked, which sought to bring together research and debate on the role of cultural networks, so in a global art ecology. 262 artists, art managers and curators from 40 different countries assembled into this discourse debate. This is Tilting Axis within and beyond the Caribbean, which is a question of how do we produce models of connectivity within sustainable models, organised by the Fresh Milk art platform in the Caribbean, in Barbados, earlier this year, for which there were 30 global representatives in this interrogation of what the question of sustainability and instituting of new spaces, resources, and networks would be within an African, Caribbean, situation. In the US, we see new situations as well, like Common Field, as opposed to Common Practice. Common Field is a new network established in 2015, established because there is no national public organisation or body representing the interests of artist-led and independent situations. And many of its historical precedents have disappeared, such as the National Association of Artists Organisations in the US, which is no longer operable. And Common Field seeks to replace that agenda, and their conference will take place in September of this year in Minneapolis. It's the third of the Hand in Glove conferences, which Common Field has now established itself out of these dialogues, and then is consistently developing its model. the Arterial Network, which is a network that is placing sort of artworks into civil society networks, sort of again across sort of Africa, sort of Arterial Network is really trying to sort of interrogate how to build organizational individual capacity towards a sustainable frame, but using sort of artist-led projects as a means by which to develop a skill set potentially, but also interested in regional and cross-nation dialogue as a way to do it. Artist Run Copenhagen, which took place, sort of just a few years ago, which Alison also addressed, which had a set of kind of discourses and debates, but also sort of research that was being conducted that was examining the different models within sort of Danish artist-led spaces in a comparative analysis with Australian models. The Australian sort of situation is 40 years old, actually, in terms of ARI's, Artists Run initiatives, and there was a large seminar in Sydney, Australia, which brought together these communities for the first time, actually, sort of in its 40th anniversary, called We Are Here. There's other networks, such as Cluster, which is 8 visual arts organisations and structures. So we find organisations like Casco in Utrecht involved in many of these networks, actually, including some of those that I've already sort of mentioned. So as an organisation, they are very much sort of fielding themselves as a leader within this sort of situation. But Cluster is also been organising events and paying activity or attention, for example, to the Middle East, but also to Southeast Asia, sort of including, for example, their event here, sort of which takes place in the Philippines. There is been previous sort of stuff also done in the US, including sort of models, modes, and potentials, which is an event interrogating Chicago. And Chicago has a very vibrant and long history of artist-led sort of cultures and sort of spaces, including an event that celebrated 25 years of this activity called Artists Run Chicago, sort of which was a precedent to this models, modes, and potentials. I'm almost done, Signa. And then we are also seeing events like this one, Draft, which took place last week in Mumbai, which was assembling people from Bombay, Cairo, Cape Town, Hamburg, Hong Kong, Mexico City, Shanghai, St. Petersburg, and Zurich, sort of for a conference to address intercultural discourse on contemporary art and the instituting of new institutional frames for its production and thought, which is a 3-day event in which there will be a subsequent conference in 2017 in Zurich. I've also, as has Mick as part of the Stretch project, engaged, for example, with things like this, which is Footfalls in Ireland, which somebody cited at the beginning, Georgiana did, which also produced a report on the value of artist-run spaces within the Irish sort of context, sort of in part collaboration with an organisation in Ireland called the Para Institution, which is directed by a woman called Megs Morley, who also has established an archive of artist-led spaces in Ireland, which is currently on exhibit at the Irish Museum of Modern Art. There are other projects that are just about to begin, like Formally Informally in Belgrade, that basically will also interrogate the histories and potentialities of artist-led activities, culture centres, sort of within Serbia. Institutions are also paying attention to this in particular ways as well, and this is the museum as hub, sort of from the New Museum in New York, sort of which basically also produced a set of assemblies around this, but also a set of data and online provisions, tools, etc., of multiple, I think 400 global art spaces, etc. This is Sydney, Australia. Then there are European Union funded sort of projects within sort of global frames. This is Curating in Depth, which is 3 projects, sort of that will take place over a sort of 3-year period. So they are partnered with the Asia-Europe Foundation, Arts Network Asia, and the European Network Trans-Europe Hall. And Trans-Europe Hall, sort of is an organisation that basically deals with, it's a network of spaces dealing with post-industrial buildings across Europe, sort of, and post-industrial buildings are being used for art activities, sort of. And yeah, I suppose can return us in a sense to that. So basically that's what really I've been doing in this sort of 3 months that I began to sort of look at the project, is one, to consider this thing of what stretching is, how it relates to shrinking in a sense, but also to sort of look at what conversations are happening, where, who is attending and who is mobile within them, and where conversations are happening that are geographically limited, or to look at the conditions of specific sort of places, but also interrogating the aesthetics of these conversations. How are these conversations being aesthetically and dynamically sort of framed, and who are the power brokers within them, both in terms of sort of agencies, organizations, funding situations, and which people are being multiply recycled through these conversations. Thank you.